Parasite, an analysis of class, by Michael Frostow, Benjamin Rasmussen, and Stephanie Yates. While the poor are in constant need of basic resources, the only way of gaining access to these resources through class mobility is unattainable. This is a film about class, and specifically the idea of class mobility. Though a foreign film, the theme of individualism, in that to succeed you must push others out of the way, is relevant to American culture when it comes to the American dream. The ultimate message is that class mobility is a lie, since the upper class is defined by standards unattainable by those below, and that the underclass struggle is a commonality, not a competition. Symbolism present to show class hierarchy is seen in a rock that Kims receive as a gift, commonly known as the Scholar's Rock. It signifies the hope that class mobility is possible for the Kims. As the movie progresses, they literally and figuratively cling to this rock for hope. As the Kims' home is flooded, the rock floats on top of the water, signifying the hope they have for a way out, even when they are drowning in their misfortunes.
Although they are desperate to escape poverty, the film shows how moving up the socioeconomic ladder is nearly impossible due to the standards set by those above. We are really rooting for the Kims. We want to see them succeed in a typical rags to riches story. And as American viewers, we're very invested in this idea that hard work leads to success, since it's basically the American dream. But the movie shows that this isn't always the case. After being introduced to the Kims in the opening scenes, we were met with another scene where they're sitting in toxic fumes trying to learn to fold pizza boxes so they can make money.
뭐라 이게
아우 얘는 달인이구만. 뭐야? 소독해?
요즘도 저런 걸 하네.
그러게요.
창문 닫아.
나도 봐. 공짜로 집안에 소독도 하고 곱등도 없애고.
그래. 요새 곱등이 너무 많아.
내가 아까 닫으라 그랬지?
닫을까요?
But when it comes time to apply for the position, they're denied, at least initially, because the company demands a perfect product for their brand. So they're clearly putting in the hard work, they're putting in the effort. But while the poor toil away to achieve this standard of perfection for barely a living wage, the more lucrative opportunities are reserved and effectively gatekept by and for the wealthy. When the Kims finally do get into a better position, working for the Parks, who are the rich family, it's through recommendation. And that's after faking a lot of their background. Mrs. Park even says that her hiring process is through a chain of recommendation, and that she only considers those in her belt of trust. One of the main reasons they don't get caught is because the Parks consider this idea of class stress and class reinforcement, as well as their image, more than their own common sense. And this struggle for class mobility appears throughout the movie in many different forms, both in kind of concrete scenes such as this one, and more abstract symbols.
The rock's ability to float shows that it is hollow, which represents the idea that class mobility is a hollow hope and a superficial symbol rather than a concrete form of motivation. Although the rock may stay in sight on top of the water, it is merely a trick. As if the Kims relied on it to keep them on top of the water, they would most likely sink along with their dreams of making it out of poverty. With the system currently in place, anyone at the bottom would have the same fate, as class mobility is merely a dream. Eventually, as Kiwoo dreams of achieving class mobility, he places the rock back in the water as a testament to his imaginary achievement and lets go of the arduous task of making it to the top.
So right from the beginning scene and through various symbolic references scattered throughout the movie, we're shown how stacked it is against people trying to work their way up. By the time they can scam their way into their positions, the act of committing forgery itself becomes less about the Kim's character, but more about how the upper class remains inaccessible to those below, with the only means of rising up being to cheat the system altogether. But it's not the rich who are held responsible for the class barrier, but the poor, who are in turn expected to fight it out. And much like the idea of class mobility, the movie represents this interclass struggle in multiple ways, both in concrete action scenes, but also in its surroundings.
The struggle of the poor can be seen in the representation of the structure of societal structure. There is also much symbolism in the difference in level of the Kims and Parks homes. The Parks and every other rich family in that area live in high elevation, where the sunlight shines brightest and the water falls softly and drains away. On the other hand, the Kims live at the lowest level in the city. Their house is even underground, where sunlight is limited and every bit of rain, trash, and sewage can collect. All the harshness of life does not affect the Parks at the top of the hill. It funnels down to where the poor people live, and it affects them much more. The less fortunate work for the rich and supplement life at the top of the social hierarchy, while their relatively small wages keeps them at the bottom. The next day the Parks see the rain as a blessing, as it has cleared out the pollution and made a blue sky. The Kims, on the other hand, see it as a curse, as it has destroyed their home, displaced them, and all the while they could not enjoy the blue sky, as sunlight does not make it down to where they live.
비 안 왔으면 어쩔 뻔했냐고요. 그리고 선물은 절대 사오지 마. 진짜로. 맞다. 자기 미니 쿠퍼니까 그냥 우리 차고 안에 그냥 우겨 넣어.
Symbolism can be seen also in the park's basement itself and the struggle to get out.
As Michael mentioned, the basement serves as a symbol of class with which both lower class parties, the Kims and the old housekeeper Moon Wing, are trying to escape. Later in the movie, when the Kims find Moon Wing's husband living in the basement, they learn that he's remained undetected because the original architect was so embarrassed by its inclusion that he never mentioned it to the Parks. This shows how the lower class are not only forgotten, but the idea of being poor itself is something of shame and not to be talked about. When Moon Wing pleads with the family to help their situation, the Kims, having at least superficially shed the label of being poor, look down on their counterparts and scoff at their situation. The fight that ensues is literally about who gets to come up on top and enjoy the luxuries of the upper floor. And the fight isn't just based in the material desire of, say, a better living condition, but also in the psychological desire of distancing oneself from the lower class. The thought of remaining or associating with the poverty of the lower class is so repulsive that both the Kims and Moon Wing and her husband are pitted against each other, despite coming from a similar background.
Near the end of the movie, Kiwoo clings to the rock tightly as he travels down to the basement of the Park's home. It slips out of his grasp and ends up in the hands of another poor family living in the basement hoping for a way out. After a scuffle, Kiwoo ends up with the rock, only to be caught by the other family and beat over the head with it. One family's success for obtaining this rock and getting to the top proves to be a near-death sentence, as everyone is looking for a chance to hold on to this symbol of hope and a chance to leave their misfortuned lives. It is a struggle that could prove fatal, but to these people, it is worth it.
One of the major themes of this film is the injustice of how the plight of the poor goes largely unnoticed. This is kind of circling back to how the basement and, as a result, the underclass is very out of sight, out of mind for the Parks. One of the things that reinforces this idea is the classical music, which is played over the most intense scenes, all of which happen to revolve around the poor fighting each other. The violence is almost voyeuristic, and while the audience isn't as oblivious as the Parks to the Kim situation, we're still allowed to sit back in the comfort of our seats and watch the scene play out to soothing instrumentals, effectively detaching us from the struggle that's occurring. In the film, however, this detachment doesn't arise from pleasant music, but rather from the differences in social class.
Like we've shown earlier, Parasite is a movie that unapologetically shows the stark difference in class that is present in the world, and especially South Korea. It uses imagery and parallelism to show the roles of class hierarchies and the interactions within and between each class. The class that the Kims live in is a class that seems very difficult to move out of. The movie shows that the other side of this coin in the Park family. They have a mansion designed by a famous architect, a housemaid, a personal driver, and all the resources to give their children the best education possible. They even have the means to afford character, as Chung Suk says that Cho Yoo-jeong is not rich because she's nice, but nice because she is rich.
With the hardships of the lower class being largely ignored, the interclass fighting takes on a more tragic light. The poor are in the same boat as they struggle to survive, and have no reason to resent each other. There is no clear demonstration of this in the scene where the Kims escape the fire at the parks, only to return home and find their basement flooded.
아주 좋아. 가만히 있어봐. 가만. 아씨 어지럽네.
기정아, 조심해. 이게 아무거나 만지지 마.
여보, 나 확실히 내진 땅인가 봐. 당신이 안 보여.
Despite all this effort to scramble over the scraps, while one might hold a fleeting sense of power, the movie argues that this individualistic mentality of pushing others down to get ahead only ends in misery, or at the very least, conditions that aren't any better than where someone started. The end result of the basement struggle leaves both parties worse off, with Moonwing and her husband tied or unconscious under the house in the basement, and the Kims pressed to the floor under the Parks, who take no notice. The end of the movie isn't the Kims finally finding happiness and wealth, but with the family injured, imprisoned, or dead, where they are living in the same semi-basement they started in. Nothing has changed, and all the members of the lower class come out as losers, as ultimately it's the rich who hold all the cards.
Finally, the ending scene ties everything together, with the two worlds of struggling underclass and oblivious upper class collide, with the result following the pattern we've come to expect. The rich do not care.
정수가 안 돼! 정수가 안 나와!
이리 말고! 기다릴 때 눌러!
여보!
아파.
잠깐만 차! 김기사! 뭐해!
앰뷸런스 기다리면 되죠?
아빠 그만 좀 눌러. 눌러서 더 아픈 것 같아.
택시 타고 와! 택시 좀 던지라고! 택시 던지라고 그냥!
안녕하세요, 박 사장님.
나 알아?
리스펙트!
movie shows the way the situation looks from the outside, and also the way that lower-class citizens of South Korea see it. But statistics gathered seems to tell a different story.
So, in this section, we're going to be looking at outside sources, scientific sources based on scientific studies, but also some other sources to see how that lines up with reality. The message of the movie lines up with reality. Okay, so first of all, we find that, yeah, it really does suck to be poor. It's kind of common sense that it's better to be rich, but being poor can have psychosocial factors that make it worse for you, like the shame that you have in yourself for not doing well, or the shame that society puts on you for being poor. And then when you combine those, it's not that great. So it's not good to be poor. It agrees with that in the movie, which portrays poorness as kind of tough. They're trying to not be poor anymore. So that's the idea of the movie. Okay, moving on. More specifically in the movie, we see the conditions that the Kims are living in, and it's actually what a lot of Koreans are living in. This is because a couple of reasons. Mostly that Korea experienced a rapid growth in the 50s, and they had building codes which made them build bomb shelters against the North Koreans, but the population pressures forced them to rent those bomb shelters as living spaces. So a lot of semi-basements built as bomb shelters are now houses. The 1997 financial crisis further polarized the wealth gap in Korea. So now the rich people are even richer. The poor people, I mean, there's a lot of poor people still. So, yeah, the movie starkly contrasts the rich Parks and the poor Kims. One of them gets to see sunlight, the other one has tiny itty bitty windows. And then another study shows that the higher classes have a vested interest in keeping class distinctions, while the lower class have a vested interest in getting rid of class distinctions. So, as an example of this in the movie is when you might see Mr. Park complaining about Mr. Kim, the poor guy's smell, and then Mr. Kim sniffs himself and makes a face like, well, what is he talking about? This is what I smell like. And that sort of shows Mr. Kim, he picks up on the smell and uses that as a distinctor between his class and his servant's class. While the servant is like, but this is just how I smell, it's not anything, so he's trying to ignore that. So the movie voices the thoughts of many people, so yeah, that's a given, otherwise it would be a popular movie. And in interviews with some of these people who live in the Banjihas in South Korea, a lot of them say they've given up hopes of moving out. And we already talked about what the Banjihas are. An interview with a Mr. Kim who lived in one of these places says, "You will get sick if you constantly envious of what you can't have." And he's talking about he was asked, like, what do you think about moving out? So he sort of has given up hope, too. You get that sentiment from the quote. Yeah, it's common for this sort of pessimistic attitude or idea to be had, but young people are still optimistic about moving out. Like, students will be renting these places, and they're planning on, once they get out of college and make money. And this is represented in the movie by young Master Kim. He dreams of getting rich in the future as well. Next up, we have that Korea has an extraordinarily high suicide rate, especially for a developed country. This is like for a variety of reasons, but hey, you can't discount hopelessness of bettering your conditions as a factor in suicide. So just keep that in mind too. Next, moving on to wealth gap and class mobility. So there's this thing called the Great Gatsby curve, which is it's sort of a trend noticed among especially more developed countries like European ones, where that as the wealth gap increases, class mobility decreases. This is actually not true for America or South Korea. America has an IGE, which is intergenerational income elasticity rating of 4 to 6. It's just sort of like a rating number. I don't know exactly what it means, but it's about twice as high as Korea's. Korea is somewhat mobile versus has somewhat class mobility versus the U.S. So this proves that it is actually very possible for the lower class to claw their way to higher station, and it is not in fact impossible as Parasite seems to convey. Furthermore, it does not seem like this is becoming the case more and more as we go into the future at all. So that's that for that. And in conclusion, the foreign film Parasite has managed to get a lot of popularity because it presents a message that a lot of people can empathize with. But hey, you gotta remember to not be too pessimistic, because otherwise, who knows, the suicide rate might go up.